for Writers Week.
You better be scared.
Welcome to day one, 6th period. You guys excited? Yeah. That was tepid. You guys excited? We are too. Lots of people to thank. This wouldn't be possible without the donations from the boosters. So if your parents are boosters, go home and give them a hug and tell them how much you love Writers Week. Thanks to the Fremd English department, who does so much work behind the scenes, year-round, to make this event happen. And a lot of other departments contributed as well, so thanks to them. Most importantly, thanks to you, and you, and you, and all y'all. You guys get it. You are the reason why Writers Week continues to happen. You are the reason why people work so hard to make it happen, so we can bring this to you. And every year you guys reciprocate, and we are very thankful for your attention, your appreciation, your participation in Writers Week. So thank you. All right, the author behind me is Rebecca Mackay. She is the author of the short story collection, Music for Wartime. We have copies here for sale for $16 if you're interested, and she'll be more than happy to sign them to you. She is the author of the 100-Year House, which is the winner of the Chicago Writers Association Award. She's also the author of The Borrower, which was a Booklist Top 10 debut that has been translated into 8 languages. Her short fiction won a 2017 Pushcart Prize and was chosen for the Best American Short Stories for 4 consecutive years. She's the recipient of a 2014 NEA Fellowship. She's on the MFA faculty at Sierra Nevada College. She has taught at the Iowa Writers Workshop, Tin House, and Northwestern University. So please help me in welcoming Rebecca Mackay.
Hi. So I just spoke to your peers last period, and I know that there are a few people, especially faculty, who were here then and are still here now. And I was told possibly a couple students, so if that's the case, I'm basically mostly going to repeat myself, maybe with some different examples. But I'm going to read something different at the end, so that you guys aren't bored. But what I'm going to do in general is I'm going to talk first about what it means to be a high school writer, which is something I remember very clearly, and what it means to be a writer as an adult. Kind of give you some general advice about, for those of you who are interested in pursuing any kind of creative career, but particularly writing. And then I'm going to talk to you specifically about a couple elements of fiction that should be interesting for most of you, even if you're not writers. And then finally, I'll read to you, and we'll have some question and answer. So, I am speaking specifically to those of you who are interested in something like writing. Maybe some of you are interested in screenwriting, in filmmaking, in drama, in photography, in areas like that. And I think that these things apply. One of the reasons I love talking to high school students is I feel like it's important for you guys to hear some of this stuff about pursuing your artistic stuff, because I don't think you get that from necessarily the rest of the world. Hear this constant message that, it's all about math and science. And that's not actually what I see to be true out in the world. We need writers, we need artists, we need musicians. You can actually make money doing these things. You can find gainful employment one way or another. And I think that almost all of you have something, I'm assuming, that you do right now that you feel is an artistic outlet. Am I right? Like, if it's, it might be poetry, it might be music, it might be making videos, something like that. And then if you think about your parents, how many of them still have that creative outlet? How many of them sit down and play an instrument, paint, write poetry, make a movie with their friends? Hopefully for some of you that's true, but for a lot of you, probably the answer would be that no, your parents don't actually do that anymore. Somewhere along the way it dropped off. And I don't know, I think that's sad. I hope that, I'm going to be talking specifically about people who really are interested in writing, but even if, whatever sound possibly sad, but I promise it's not. Which is, it's something that I finally realized when I was in my mid-20s, and it let me go much easier on myself for the kind of writer I was at the time. And I wish that I'd realized this when I was much younger. Which is that there is no such thing as a writing prodigy. So what I mean by that, prodigy is someone who is doing the best work of their life, or work that is as good as the best work they'll ever do in their lives, as a child or as a teenager. So you could have a chess prodigy. You could have like an 18-year-old who's as good as they'll ever be at chess, and can be, the best people in the world. You can have a prodigy in certain sports, but not others. That's interesting, right? You can be a prodigy in music, in, say, playing the violin. Mozart was composing like world-class stuff when he was like 10. So you can have prodigies in certain areas, but for whatever reason, and I challenge you to prove me wrong, there have been young adults who've gotten published, there have been teenagers who've gotten published, but they're not creating some of the best literature out there, right? And I don't think they're necessarily doing the best work of their lives. They're not writing something better when they're 16 than they would write when they were 42. If you look at look at the stuff you're reading in class, look at the stuff that you're reading on your own. How old was the person who wrote that? Chances are they were not in high school. And I think you know that already, and I knew that when I was in high school. And when I was in high school, I really wanted to be a writer. But what I didn't quite get was that meant, first of all, that I shouldn't be despairing when I compared myself to where I wanted to be. Because by the time you're in high school, your taste is developed enough that you can read the best stuff ever written. You might find your favorite book that's going to be your favorite book for life. You know, likewise, what a good photograph looks like, what really good music sounds like. You know those things, right? But then you open your mouth to sing, or you try to take a picture, or you try to write a story, and it doesn't come out quite that same way. And this is where something really strange happens. Because for certain pursuits, everyone understands how much work and how much time it's going to take. So for instance, you tried to play football, and it didn't work out that well the first time. You don't go, well, I guess I'm just destined to never be a football player, because I wasn't as good the first time out as the people I see on TV. You understand that it's going to take years and years of training and practice. Other things, though, I think music can be one of them, and writing can be another. We expect ourselves to be brilliant the first time out, or expect ourselves at least to be showing incredible talent, for it to be coming out the way we wanted it to come out the first time. And if it doesn't, we get tremendously discouraged. Writing is not, although there is such a thing as talent, I do believe that, and you see that. You see that some people, it comes easier to them, other people have to work harder, right? That's all what talent is. But despite that, I firmly believe that writing is a long craft. It has more in common with something like learning a really intricate craft like basket weaving in some like incredibly traditional style. It's going to take you years to learn. And less in common with something like the violin, where people who are going to be good at it are good at it almost right away. And I think that's probably because we all tell stories, we all talk, we can all speak in our different ways. And so we assume that writing should come as easily as that, instead of understanding that it's a really long craft, a really long practice. Writing is a long study for several reasons. One of them is simply life. In order to tell a story about humans, in order to tell a story about life that the rest of the world is going to respond to, you need to have done some living. And I know you've done some living already, but you need to do even more. There are things about the world in 10 years that you're not able to say now. Also, the other reason I believe it's a long craft that you should be studying now and not stopping if you're interested in this at all. Because this is not like stop writing and wait until you're 30. This is start now and don't stop, so that you can tell a great story by the time you're 30. The other reason I think that writing is a really long study, a really long craft, is that it takes so long to absorb other people's writing. If you were a musician, you could listen to the complete works of Beethoven in about a day. If you were a visual artist, you could go to the museum and you can see a Picasso painting in like half a second. If you study it for longer than that, but you've seen it. But as a writer, if you're gonna absorb all this influence that you need to be absorbing, it's gonna take you years. Because it takes you, what, at least a week to read a book, presumably, right? So think about all the work that's out there that you haven't read yet, how long that's going to take you. Which is not to say that it's some insurmountable task, but simply to say it takes a really long time. And I'll teach classes in the city. I teach at a place called Story Studio, which I'm planning that name now. Those of you who end up living in the city and if you're interested in writing 15 years from now, it'll still be there. It's a great place to take writing classes. I'm constantly getting sort of a 60-year-old coming into my class going, yeah, I wrote a little bit in high school and then I stopped for the past 40 years. And I have an idea for a novel and I really want to write it now. And that's great. And it's not that they can't, but they still have like a 10 or 15-year apprenticeship period to put in. And they don't have the patience for that necessarily. They have this idea and they want it out there now, and it ends up, in some cases, sort of tripping them up and making them very frustrated. You have right now the gift of time for whatever artistic pursuit you might be interested in. No one is looking at you going, when are you going to sell your work? No one's asking you to support your family from this at this point. You can write in the dark. You can, figuratively, I don't think you could literally write in the dark. You can write with nobody watching you for a really long time still. And the same with other things. You can make films that nobody will ever see, that you're going to throw away. You can sing, and it doesn't have to be on a stage. You have this gift of time now, and kind of only now. So that's my sort of pep talk for you. The part that goes with it, the sort of forgiving yourself part, for the fact that you have this great taste, presumably, if you are interested in a certain art form. If you're a photographer, you probably have great taste in photography. If you're a poet, you probably have great taste in poetry. So you're going to recognize the ways that your own efforts are falling short. It's going to feel really awkward to you. The people who don't have great taste are going to put something out there and think it's fantastic when it isn't. And if you don't believe me, I guess they don't, American Idol isn't on anymore, but things like that. You watch the auditions from American Idol, and the people who go in and they're really nervous, but then they have this beautiful voice. That's one thing, but the people who go in going, I'm the best singer that ever sang a song, I'm gonna be fantastic, and then they sound like dying frogs. You gotta think something's actually off with their taste level, right? Their understanding of what good music sounds like. So it's actually, this is counterintuitive, but it's a great sign when you can't stand your own work. That's a really good sign. It's not a terrible sign if you like your own work, but it is a great sign when you don't like it, because it means that you're recognizing that gap between where you are and where you might one day want to be. In specific, at the age that you are, if you're really making progress, it's quite likely that you're going to be completely embarrassed and disgusted by work that you did 6 months ago, a year ago, even last week. I don't know if you've had that experience where by the time you write a poem, you hand it in, and by the time your teacher has handed it back to you, you're mortified to look at it. And that is a great sign. It means that wherever you were when you wrote that thing, you have moved on from it. You have grown and evolved and learned something. sometimes that might happen over a course of 5 minutes, because just by writing it, you learn something. Now you know something that you didn't know when you wrote it, and you're able to look back and go, ew. And for a lot of young writers, and I think a lot of people in almost any artistic field, that's where they give up. And this is sad because these are the very people who should keep going. The ones who are making progress, who have good taste, who recognize where it's not measuring up, are then getting discouraged by that gap and going, well, never mind. And this is too embarrassing, I can't keep doing it. So I would encourage you to take that as a great sign. When you look back at the work that you did and you can't stand it, you can't believe you ever thought those things, you can't believe you ever thought that was funny or moving, you can't believe that you wrote a sentence that sounded that clunky, and now you recognize that. That's a very good thing. For the same reason, I will say, because I'm speaking here specifically to people who are really serious about their writing, I'm seeing two tech trends more and more with young writers, high school and college age. One is the tendency at a very young age to try to write an entire novel. This idea that I want to be a writer, so I'm going to write a fantasy novel. I'm going to write a romance novel, I'm going to write a literary novel, whatever it is. The problem with that, I hate to say that that's problematic because it's a great thing, knock yourself out, but be warned. It's going to take you 2 or 3 years to finish that. You are going to be a completely different person in 2 or 3 years. Think back to how old you were 3 years ago. Think about the stuff you were into and what a novel would have been like that you might have started writing 3 years ago. For some of you, you were like 12, right? So would you still want to now be working on something you started back then? Probably not. So those of you who really are interested in writing, I would encourage you to write short stories, complete short stories. And this is going to tie into what I'm saying about craft in a minute. Very often the writing exercises that we're given are write a short paragraph, write a scene, describe something, and those are great, but they're not full stories. Try to write a 6,000 word story, 4,000 to 8,000 words, somewhere in that range. A full short story, like you might read for a class when you're given a short story to read, right? That length. That's going to teach you much more than trying to write a novel would, and it's going to teach you more than writing a little paragraph would as well, because you're writing something complete. The other trend that I'm seeing with young writers, and I think this isn't just writing, this is filmmaking, it's photography, it's other things too, is this temptation to, as soon as you finish something, stick it up online where the world can see it. And first of all, if you're making progress, you might be embarrassed by that a little bit later in your life. You never know how long this stuff is going to stick around. But also, you start writing in a different way. You start writing in a way that is going to get people's approval. You start writing in a way that you think people are going to respond to. You start writing to fit in with a certain community of fantasy writers maybe, or something else. And you're not doing that, you're not taking advantage of that really cool time you have to write in the dark with nobody watching. Ultimately, eventually, maybe you do want to put your stuff out there, but probably in a different way. So what I'm going to talk about now is, I'm going to give you something sort of concrete to think about in terms of the structure of a story. And this is something, the reason I'm choosing this to talk about is it should be helpful for writers, but it should actually be helpful for when you're reading things for English class as well. And it's something that you can actually think about for movies that you watch. You can think about it in almost any storytelling context. So here's what it is. Stories are about change. Ultimately, what makes a story, and not just someone rambling on, is that something happens that's interesting. So if I tell you the story that, okay, I was supposed to come speak at Fremd today, so I got in my car, and I drove here, and I followed my map, and I got here, and I parked in the parking lot, and I came inside, and I got up on stage, and I said the things that I thought I was going to say, and I finished, and I went home. That's a sequence of events, but it's not a story. That's really a bad story, right? If contrast, I say, I was supposed to come speak at Fremd today, but on my way out of my house, I got sprayed by a skunk. And I was like, oh hell, what am I gonna do now? I'm late. Do I go back in and change? Do I show up smelling like a skunk? So I got in my car anyway. And then, when I was halfway here, I got a flat tire. So, what makes that a story is that something changed. I had a plan, and then that plan did not work out. Something different happened. So, when we think about the arc of a story, and by that I mean, at some point in your English career, you're going to see this if you haven't yet, but you probably have your English teacher drawing sort of a big arc on the chalkboard, on the whiteboard, like a big triangle, rising action, climax, falling action, or denouement. Does that sound familiar, kind of? Okay. Good, they're doing their job. That's a real thing that writers actually think about. Your English teachers did not make that up to torture you with. That is a real thing. It is also really the structure of basically every story ever told. Aristotle in ancient Greece, in his book Poetics, is pointing out the structure of stories, the arc of stories, the way they change. And this is before anyone in the world had ever written a novel. He's talking about the Greek theater. And still that structure stays. I think there's something really fundamentally in our DNA about that structure, what makes a story satisfying to a human being. If you ever want to test this, watch a movie and pause the movie like half an hour before the end and ask yourself why you would be completely ticked off if the movie ended right then. You would be, right? Like, my husband and I have this running joke when we're watching a movie and like if the screen goes dark just in between scenes, or one of us will be like, the end. And the reason it's funny in context, like when we're watching a movie, is it would be a hilariously bad place for the movie to end, right? So there's something universal about storytelling, about what makes a satisfying story. It has to do with that arc, which hopefully you're learning a lot about, but I want to give you some specific things to think about on that arc. This is not a formula, this is just like kind of the skeleton of a story. Every satisfying story that's truly narrative fiction, that's relying on story and not doing something wacky, experimental, has at least two major moments of change. One really close to the beginning of the story, and one right around the climax of the story. So we could think through, throwing out stories that presumably a lot of you know, fairy tales. Think through like Little Red Riding Hood. Change at the beginning of the story. She was skipping on her way to her grandmother's house. Now there's this major problem with the big bad wolf. Major change. A lot of other changes happen. Ultimately, by the end of the story, she's been eaten, the grandmother's been eaten, and in the original gory version, the ultimate change is some hunter comes and cuts the wolf open with an axe, I think, is that right? Big change, now she's released. I was talking to the earlier period about the Wizard of Oz. You guys all know the story of the Wizard of Oz, basically, right? So, does a good job of establishing what normal was, especially the movie, spends a lot of time establishing gray, Kansas prairie. This was normal, but then, major dramatic change. Tornado picks up her house, puts her in Oz, Technicolor in the movie, everything's different. And that first change is often the one that really sets the story in motion. If you didn't have that first change, you wouldn't have the story. A lot of other things happen. Ultimate final change at the climax of the story is she gets to click her heels together 3 times, she gets to go home. That's how everything turns out. She was in Oz, now she's back in Kansas. And by the way, when I say the climax of the story, I think people get confused about that word and think it means the most exciting part of the story. That's not what that word means. The climax of the story is the tipping point. It's the place where whatever we were reading to find out, whatever it was that hung in the balance, like, will she get home or won't she? Will, the bad guy be defeated or not? Will they get together romantically or won't they? It's the moment where that's decided. And it might not be a scene of intense action, but it's the moment where you could say, yeah, from this point on, we know how it's all going to play out. because this is the deciding point. So that's why there's usually a really big change there. Because if it just turned out exactly the way that we thought it would all along, I was gonna go speak at Fremd, so I got there and I spoke. That's not change. So we want some kind of change to happen out there. So I invite you to do this with every story you absorb, every story that you think about. You can do this with a sitcom episode, you can do it with a movie, you can do it with things you read. You can even do this in the cafeteria as your friends are telling stories to each other. Because you know you get in that pattern of someone tells a story about a dog, and then everybody has a dog story to share, right? And maybe some of them you've heard before, because you've been friends with these people for a while, so you're like, yeah, the story about the dachshund, okay, I remember. Listen to what your friend is doing with the way they tell the story. It might not be a good story. So those ones you can maybe think about why it's not a great story. The ones that are really good, or even a joke that somebody tells that's really successful, that has the build-up, why is it? And can you identify in there those two kind of moments of change? I'm going to tell you a whole little tiny story right now because I kind of joked about this in the last period, but I didn't tell them the actual story, so I'm going to tell you the story. This is one of the best stories that someone just told me socially recently. I'm going to tell you the story, and then I'm going to go back and dissect it. She's an adult. She was house sitting for her mother. Her mother was out of town. And so she would go over every morning and water the plants and just check that everything was okay and leave. So the second morning, though, she gets to her mother's house, and there's some stuff rearranged, and it's kind of freaking her out. She remembered that there was like a stack of books on the floor. The stack of books is knocked over, and there's this gate that she keeps, like a little fence she keeps between the kitchen and the living room normally, because normally she has a dog, but the dog isn't there, and the gate is sort of pushed out. So she's really freaked out. So she comes back and she fixes it. She comes back the next day, and the gate is like 6 feet across the floor. So now she's like, okay, there's a ghost or something. This is really freaking me out. So she puts it back, calls her mom, and is like, do you know what's going on? Mom goes, I have no idea. Comes back the next morning. The gate is 6 feet across the floor in a totally different direction. She's completely freaking out. Suddenly, her mom calls her, and her mom goes, oh my God, I figured it out. It's the Roomba. They're like, the Roomba vacuum. It was like turning on at night, because it was programmed to, and it was like dragging this thing across the floor and knocking down the books. She was convinced there was a ghost. Okay, so she told this story because we were telling ghost stories. I thought it was really funny. Here's why that works. That's the kind of story that you would just tell socially, right? You could probably write it down too, but first change. She established normal. She was house sitting in her mother's house. First major change. Something isn't as it should be. Something is amiss. Things are moving. She thought it was going to go one way, but now it's going another. And if the story had just ended there, it could have been a cool, creepy, like, we never found out. That could have been cool too. But then, other changes, it increases. One thing you might talk about with rising action on that arc is increasing stakes. Things get worse and worse. Things get weirder and weirder. And we're waiting to find out, what is this? What's going on? And finally, that ultimate change is, we learn what it is, it's solved. She went from thinking there was a ghost to understanding that it was a robot vacuum. And that's the end of the story, right? So, and this is just something someone told me last week, you're gonna find these everywhere you look. It actually, I think, makes watching movies, reading stories, listening to your friends talk more interesting when you can analyze it that way. I'm probably making you all really self-conscious for the next lunch period, because I also talked to a whole other group of students. You're all going to be really self-conscious in your stories now. But it's fun to do. For those of you who actually are writers, or who are interested in drama, in filmmaking, that kind of thing, this matters a great deal. And those of us who write for a living, we actually think about this. I will literally draw that triangle, that pyramid, on a piece of paper, like I first saw it in 6th grade, and I will map my story out on it. Sometimes after I've written it, when I want to make sure, sometimes when it's stuck, sometimes when I'm at the very beginning and I'm not sure how it's going to go, literally use that as a tool. And I would invite about, do I have enough changes? Because the typical high school story that I used to write, and I think this comes out of a lot of our writing assignments being like, write a scene, write a description. The typical high school story that I used to write was, someone is sitting on their porch, looking out at the city and being sad, and thinking about how cities are all about alienation, and then a truck drove past, the end. There's not really a lot of change in there. So this is one of the reasons I'm encouraging you to write entire stories. You can't maintain you can do that for a few pages and think you're clever. You can't really do that for 6,000 words and still think that that works. You're gonna get sooner or later that it needs some plot to it. Plot actually matters. The other thing, so this is sort of the advanced level, like level 2 of all this, is getting in changes that work. What kind of change would that be? It's very tempting, I think, to write a very quiet internal change, and that might be what I was going for in high school with stories like that. You know, I was sitting there and I was sad, but then I became a little bit sadder. And that would be the change. It's not very dramatic, it's really internal. Versus someone who wants to write stories where the big change is like a dinosaur attack, or an alien invasion, or spies, something big and dramatic, but we don't really get anything personal. It's not really literary because we're not really getting what's happening to a person on the inside. And the challenge for all of us as writers is to have changes happen that matter in both ways. Something actually physically happens in the world, and it actually affects that character internally too. So at the end of The Wizard of Oz, the big external change, she gets to go home. The internal change is that realization, oh, there's no place like home, I shouldn't have wished to be somewhere else, this is good enough. Those of you, do you guys read Hamlet at this school at all? No? Yes? Do you read any Shakespeare? What do you read? King Lear? You all read King Lear? Wow, okay. Romeo and Juliet? Okay, let's do Romeo and Juliet, okay. So Romeo and Juliet, well, that's an easy one. You know, the first big change, they meet and they fall in love. They're physically actually meeting. They're literally physically separated by their families. They have to literally sneak around. What's happening internally is all these feelings of love, right? So look for that. Is that change, or the changes you're seeing, or the changes you're writing, working on the external level and on the internal level? So before I read something to you, the other advice I want to give people, anyone who is interested in story, in storytelling, in filmmaking, in fiction, in any of that, is to get involved with the theater, here at your school or elsewhere while you're young. And it doesn't need to be acting necessarily. It might be running the spotlight, it might be working costumes backstage, but there is no replacement, I think, or there are plenty of replacements. I would say in my own life, I got so much out of living inside a story, night after night after night, rehearsal after rehearsal, memorizing lines. You know, I've read or experienced the plays that I was in college and in high school, far more many times than I've read even my favorite novels. Because I haven't read my favorite novel 100 times. And that's what you experience when you act. But also when you act, you're thinking about story structure. You're thinking about, why is this character supposed to come on stage now? What do they want? What changes in this scene? How should my face change from the beginning of the scene to the end of the scene, based on what this character has just experienced? Where's the internal change, in other words, to go with the external change? You are going to learn a lot from that. And it's really hard to suddenly decide to act later in life. So I'd really encourage that for all of you, anyone who's interested in any aspect of storytelling, to get involved in the theater while it's right here for you. And I understand that you have these beautiful couches as props in your plays. Is that correct? How could you pass up that opportunity? What I'm going to do, I'm going to read to you, I wanted to read something different than I read last period so that the poor teachers don't have to listen to me read the same thing twice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the beginnings of several different stories, just the very beginning. Because since we just talked about that idea of that initial change, that change that upsets the world, I kind of want to show you what that looks like, for my writing at least. So I'll just read and talk for like 5 more minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. So these are all from my story collection. This is the story collection Music for Wartime. And these were written, it's interesting, these are stories that I wrote over like a 10 or 15-year period. So from different points in my life, but I can still look back and remember, where that initial impulse came from, which often has to do with that first change. So I'm going to read you just the very beginning of a story called Cross. And this is a story where the change, it's not like we see what normal is for a long time and then we get the change. The thing that's going to disrupt this person's world is there right at the very beginning. And that's going to be different than in some other stories. There was garbage on the lawn, or maybe a construction sign, or now that she was close enough to notice the flowers and ribbons, discarded decorations from a prom. But it was late August, not spring. And no, it wasn't prom garbage, but a small cross. Celine had formed a cocoon of the summer's clothes around her cello case in the back of her little red Saab, and driven no faster than 45 from Vermont to Albany and the rest of the way home. She was crawling so slowly on these cracked and narrow streets that she didn't need to brake to see the display. A white wooden cross already